All right, I want to thank Professor Antonella Sorace for accepting our department's invitation to be one of our colloquium speakers. Dr. Antonella Sorace is a professor of developmental linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on questions connecting linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science more broadly. She is a renowned expert in bilingualism research. She has done extensive research about bilingualism over the lifespan. She is well known for her studies of near-native adult second language speakers, on the attrition and changes in the native language of advanced second language speakers. She also studied bilingualism in early and late childhood and the effects of bilingualism in non-linguistic domains. Dr. Sorace is also widely known for her research on constraint variation at the lexicon-syntax interface and her studies of gradients in natural language. Among her many accolades, she has held research appointments and visiting professorships at numerous institutions, including the University of Utrecht, Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, and the Johns Hopkins University. She's a fellow of the British Academy, a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. She was also awarded a Beltane Fellowship for Public Engagement. She founded in 2008 and directs to this day the Research and Information Center Bilingualism Matters, which now has dozens of branches around the world and strongly represents her commitment to disseminating the finds of research in bilingualism outside academia. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I also want to make an acknowledgement of the land grant to the University of Michigan from Native American tribes. The Department of Linguistics recognizes the University of Michigan's origins in a land grant for the Anishinaabe, including the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribes, and Wendat. The university continues to exist on the historical territorial land of the Anishinaabe people. Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabe and belong to the Algonquian language family. There are currently 12 recognized Anishinaabe tribes in the state of Michigan, and many Anishinaabe people living through the state and interacting at the University of Michigan. And forgive me the pronunciation of the names of the tribes, not like I practiced a lot to do that. I'm going to pass pass the floor to our speaker now. Welcome, Professor Sorace.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? I hope so.
We can hear you well.
Okay, thank you very much. And I hope you can see the screen as well. Thanks for the invitation and greetings from Scotland. It's 9 o'clock in the evening here, and it's getting pretty cold already. I'm really grateful for the invitation. I wish I could be there with you and see you in the audience, but this is not possible. But I hope we can have a good discussion. I'll definitely not speak for an entire hour. I want to leave time for discussion. So what I'm going to focus on tonight is the connection between second language learning and first language change. So what I have in my title is the ecology, because we are developing the idea that the two of them are really intimately related. And so we should really try to understand the relationship between second language learning and first language change by looking at the big picture, as I hope I'll be able to show later. So what is let's start from an easy point. So the point is that everybody knows that in second language learning, the first language can affect the second. So for many, many years, you know, that was the main focus of research on second language acquisition. So the effects of the first language called transfer or cross-linguistic influence, but in any case, the effects were studied from the first language to the second language. What we're going to talk about tonight is also effects in the other direction. And this is just a provisional definition because, as we'll see later, the effects are actually not only due to the second language, the transfer from the second language to the first. But for the time being, let's start from this statement that languages actually affect each other in bilinguals. So the main focus of what I'm going to talk about tonight is the changes that take place in first generation speakers. So these changes go under the name of attrition. I'm not very keen on this term. I will continue to use it because it's the term commonly used in the literature. But everybody can see that it has negative connotations. It has the connotations of erosion, loss. I'm going to show that attrition is not definitely only erosion and loss. Certainly not the kind of attrition that I'm going to talk about. So changes in first generation speakers who were born and raised in their original community and with their first language. And then they learned another language and typically migrated. This is the population that has been studied the most. People who actually moved to the environment where the second language is spoken. But these attrition effects can also take place if the speaker doesn't move from their original community. For the sake of simplicity, again, let's talk about first generation speakers who grew up born and raised with one language, and then they move to another language environment where the second language is spoken. Now, one of the immediate effects of this change is reduced exposure to input in the first language, right? Because clearly there's no large community around, although there may be smaller communities, we'll come back to this, but a large community of speakers of the first language is not there anymore. And also there is reduced exposure to what we can call normal variation among first language speakers. So speakers obviously speaking in different ways, which is totally normal. And we know that the exposure to variation, to normal variation, has a very strong role in language acquisition. So if we think of a monolingual child in first language acquisition, a monolingual child hears the language from a variety of speakers, very naturally, right? Men, women, old people, young people, children, adults, different registers, different pronunciations, and so on. When a speaker moves to another language community, they may not be exposed to the same kind of variation. Also, if there are other migrant speakers, other speakers from the same original community, and these speakers interact with each other, there is a lot of accommodations going on. So what we can call alignment and priming in interactions with other native speakers of the same language in the situation where the second language is spoken. And these are actually very important. We'll come back to this because people adjust to each other in particular ways when they interact with each other. So I'm going to focus on this, and I'd like to make a distinction between first generation changes, or attrition if you prefer, and second generation or subsequent generations changes taking place in second or third generation. So heritage speakers go under the name of heritage speakers. Now, heritage speakers typically hear input from parents who are undergoing changes due to attrition, to different levels, to different extents. And this is a point that is not normally considered. Certainly for a long time, research on a bilingual first language acquisition, where the child is exposed to one language that is not spoken in the environment, for example, and so a heritage language, and a language that is spoken in the environment. One of the missing links is precisely the fact that the input from parents who speak the heritage language is probably undergoing changes due to attrition. And so it's not the same kind of input that those parents received when they were growing up in their original language community. Now, if children are exposed to this kind of input, they tend to regularize. So the inconsistencies and the variation that they get, if they hear the input in sufficient quantities, then children are very good at regularizing the input. And that's when the grammar starts changing. And this is one of the, if you want, one of the entries into diachronic change. So how languages change from one generation to the next, so intergenerational changes. I'm not going to focus on this. We can come back to this in the discussion if you want, but I'm primarily going to focus on first generation attrition. So in first generation people, when does the first language start changing? This is interesting because most studies, I think, have been done on speakers who have been away from the original community for quite a long time. Certainly not from the beginning of exposure to the second language. One exception is lexical attrition. So lexical attrition, the access to the vocabulary, has been studied also in the, not the very beginning stages, but earlier stages. And so, for example, there was this study in 2009 by Link et al., where American students who spent a semester abroad in Spain were tested 3 months after their arrival in Spain, and they were compared to a control group of classroom learners of Spanish who hadn't gone to Spain, who were still in the US. And the results actually shows that even after 3 months of exposure, which is not very long, access to the English words was definitely slower in the immersion group, in the group of people who were fully immersed in a Spanish environment, compared to the students who had remained in the US. So lexical attrition seems to start pretty early, but I'm not talking about lexical attrition. I want to talk about grammar. And I want to talk about, you know, what changes in the grammar. As we'll see, the changes in the grammar are selective. In what way? So one way of defining the context of changes in the grammar is to call them, as my good friend Colin Phillips and colleagues have done, complex contingencies. So these are defined as phenomena especially involving the integration of information across multiple levels of encoding. And we'll see how this is relevant for the kind of phenomena that I'm going to talk about. So complex contingencies involving integrating information across domains. And one of the points I want to show is that there are convergences between what we see in grammatical attrition in first generation speakers and what we see in relatively advanced stages of second language learners, second language learning. So these convergences mean that in these two different populations, so native speakers in a situation of attrition, non-native speakers at higher levels of competence, we see variability in the same areas of grammar. So we see, for example, this convergence in language structures influenced by pragmatics and context. Remember, complex contingencies really involving the integration of information across domains this is a type of structures that requires the integration of grammatical, pragmatic, and contextual information. And the case of pronouns has been studied quite in depth. And so I'm going to show you examples. Examples from my own research, but not only my own research. So what happens to pronominal reference in bilingual speakers of Italian? So that's where we see the convergence that I'm going to illustrate in a moment. So both second language speakers of Italian and native Italian speakers in a situation of attrition, so who regularly use a second language, they tend to do the same thing. What they do is extending the scope of the overt pronoun to context in which you would expect the null pronoun. Now, we all know that languages, null subject languages like Italian, have a choice of pronominal forms, null and overt, which is not a random choice, as we know. It's a choice that is governed by particular pragmatic and contextual conditions. So just to show how it works in very briefly. So in monolingual Italian, if you want, so non-attrited Italian, if an Italian sees a sentence like that, that says, Paola ha salutato sua madre quando è uscita, that means Paola greeted her mother when null went out, okay? The preferred interpretation is that the null pronoun refers to the subject of the main clause. Remember that there is a potential ambiguity there because there are two potential antecedents. One is Paola, the other one is her mother. So who went out? Is it Paola or her mother? When a null pronoun is encountered, the preferred interpretation, not the categorical interpretation, and we have to be careful about this. The preferred interpretation is that the null pronoun refers to the subject of the main clause. When the same sentence is seen with an overt pronoun instead, so Paola ha salutato sua madre quando lei è uscita, without a particular stress, quando lei è uscita, so when she went out, then the preferred interpretation is that the overt pronoun refers to the non-subject antecedent, so her mother. So there seems to be a division of labor in situations where ambiguity is at stake, a division of labor such that the null pronoun tends to refer to the subject antecedent, which is also the most salient antecedent in context, and the overt subject, the overt pronoun tends to refer to the non-subject, so which is also the less salient antecedent in context. Now, what happens in bilinguals? So the effects of bilingualism are particularly seen on overt pronouns. So again, the sentence that we saw before with an overt pronoun, quando lei è uscita. Now, a bilingual person can go for that interpretation, so referring the overt pronoun to the non-subject, but they also go for the interpretation where the overt pronoun refers to the subject. In other words, there is optionality. So there isn't a clear preference, there is optionality or variation or wavering between, although there may be a preferred interpretation, but the other one, the interpretation where the overt refers to the subject, is definitely gains ground and introduces more and more optionality in the grammar. There is no effect that we see on null pronouns, on the other hand. So the effects seem to be restricted to the interpretation of the overt, but not to the interpretation of the null. So the same sentence again with the null pronoun, quando è uscita. Both monolinguals, if you want, a bilingual, and bilinguals go for the preferred interpretation where the null refers to the subject antecedent, although again, this is a preference, so the mapping of the null subject to the overt is not completely disallowed. So we're not talking about a categorical grammatical phenomenon here, but we're talking about stronger or weaker preferences. So the overt pronoun gains ground. Now, does this happen only in null subject languages? No, it happens also in non-null subject languages that offer a choice of pronominal form. So for example, German, a language like German offers a choice between two overt forms. One is a personal pronoun and the other one is a demonstrative pronoun. And interestingly, the division of labor between the personal pronoun and the demonstrative pronoun is quite similar to the division of labor between a null and an overt pronoun in null subject languages like Italian. So I will spare you my bad pronunciation of German, so I won't read these sentences aloud. But in the first sentence, which means the waiter greets the cashier, he's apparently very nice with the personal pronoun, er. The preferred interpretation is that that personal pronoun refers to the subject, antecedent, and not the non-subject. But the same sentence below with a demonstrative pronoun, der, the preferred interpretation is that there refers to the non-subject, so the cashier. So what happens in bilingual speakers of German? What we see is an extension of the demonstrative pronoun to the scope of the null, the personal pronoun. So again, there is an asymmetric effect of bilingualism leading to the extension of the scope, if you want, of the most marked form, the less frequent form also, to the domain of the less marked and most frequent form. So both German, second language speakers of German and native German speakers in a situation of attrition tend to extend the scope of the demonstrative pronoun. So again, just to illustrate, they see the sentence with the demonstrative, they can accept the interpretation that the monolinguals would go for, where the demonstrative pronoun refers to the non-subject, but they also increasingly accept the interpretation where the demonstrative refers to the subject. So there is increasing optionality. Interestingly, we do not see this effect on personal pronouns. So the personal pronoun continues to be preferred as referring to the subject antecedent. Now, why do we see these asymmetric effects? We're talking about asymmetric effects. The most, the simplest account, and in fact, the first account that many of us considered originally, is the account that assumes the effects of the second language grammar on the first language grammar. So transfer effects, cross-linguistic influence from the second language. So the grammatical knowledge of one language influences the other language. That's what I said at the beginning. Languages affect each other from a grammatical point of view. And so if we take the case of Italian or null subject languages, which originally at least were studied in situations where English was the other language, so Italians who have used English for a long time, they have been resident in an English-speaking country for a long time. Now, we can say that English is the language that has the least restrictive option. It basically doesn't have a choice of pronominal forms like Italian, and that language affects the other, regardless of whether it's the L1 and the L or the L2. Remember, we see a convergence. So we see this phenomenon both in attrited speakers and in second language speakers. In both cases, if we go for this interpretation, is a language like English that affects a language like Italian or a null subject language, but not vice versa. And I don't go into the details of yes, English is not a null subject language in the way that we understand what a null subject language is in linguistics, but it can drop subjects in very restricted circumstances, which are the same kind of circumstances in which a non-subject language would drop them. So for example, if I say a sentence like, John went to the pub with Paul and bought some beer, with a coordinate sentence where, you know, you drop the subject in and bought some beer, who, you know, there's a null pronoun there. The normal understanding is that the subject, so John went to the pub with Paul and bought some beer, it's John who bought some beer and not Paul, okay? So similar constraints, but much more restricted context in which this is possible. So what happens here, you know, if we take this interpretation, is that in attrition, there is a neutralization of an L1 distinction, okay, a native distinction, towards a less restrictive L2 system, in this case, English. In acquisition, it's the other way around. There is a neutralization, if you want, or a lack of complete acquisition of an L2 distinction, in L2 Italian, for example, towards the less restrictive L1 system. So the L1 system continues to exercise an influence even at advanced levels of competence in the second language. This is a nice story, a very simple story, but it can't be the whole story. And this is where things start getting interesting, because the overuse of overt pronouns is also attested in the second language of bilingual speakers of two languages of the same type, so with the same type of pronominal system, and not just Italian and English, for example. So overt pronouns have been found to be overextended in bilingual speakers of two null subject languages of the same type, sometimes, and sometimes not of the same type. This is not an exhaustive list, but it shows, you know, combinations involving Spanish and Italian, Greek and Spanish, Spanish and Catalan, Italian and Spanish. Our most recent study on Italian Sardinian bilinguals, so two Romance languages, both null subject, where we found this overextension. In non-null subject languages of the type that we saw we exemplified for German, the demonstratives are also overgeneralized in bilingual speakers of two languages of the same type. So for example, both Finnish and Swedish have a distinction between demonstratives and personal pronouns. And in one study, it was found that Finnish to Swedish bilinguals use demonstratives more extensively than either Finnish monolinguals or Swedish monolinguals. Another study of Dutch-German bilinguals. Dutch and German are equivalent with respect to the pronominal system they use. Again, in Dutch advanced speakers of German, there is an overextension of an overuse of demonstrative pronouns to refer to non-topical entities. And there is a lot of variability. This is what this study by Ellert actually showed. So let's explore another possibility. And when I say another possibility, I don't mean that anything that I've said before about transfer from the second language or cross-linguistic effects is not true. I'm saying that there may be another explanation that might be combined with the cross-linguistic explanation. This second account actually doesn't look at the relationship between the grammatical features of the two languages, but actually looks at bilingualism itself. So basically, as we said, for to use a pronominal system correctly, it's not enough to have the inventory of pronouns in the grammar. So grammatical knowledge gives you knowledge of the possibilities allowed by the grammar. But learning how the felicitous use of those possibilities involves what I would call interface conditions that relate grammatical choices and particular contexts. Now, these interface conditions actually change all the time. It's not that you wake up in the morning and you decide, oh, I'm going to use only overt pronouns today or null pronouns. Obviously, you have to adjust to very rapidly changes having to do with how the interaction proceeds, the degree of shared knowledge between you and your interlocutor, whether the referent that you're referring to is still salient to both you and your interlocutor or is less salient than before, and so on and so forth. So there are various contextual conditions that change all the time, and you have to be able to update your interface conditions and your connections with context. So this involves processing. It doesn't involve only grammar. And so it involves integration of grammatical and pragmatic information in real time. To go back to Colin Phillips' definition, complex contingencies. So this kind of integrations in real time. So the hypothesis here is that the grammar itself is unaffected. So what changes in first generation speakers, remember, not second, first generation speakers, the kind of changes we see don't involve the grammar. They involve access to the grammar or processing of grammatical possibilities. In fact, we have some evidence about this. So we have evidence of studies on re-exposure. So what happens when these first generation speakers who are, experiencing these changes in whatever, we're talking about, these changes, go back and are even temporarily re-immersed in the original native community. And we know from these studies that we have also done that change is reversible by re-immersion in the L1. Actually, the evidence that we have in that study, for example, is not permanent re-immersion, is not long-term re-immersion, is actually a re-immersion of a couple of weeks. So total re-immersion in the sense that speakers really go back to speaking only their original language in their original community, and they don't speak the second language. So in this kind of re-immersion, we see that these changes are partly reversed. We don't have the data in that study, for example, about longer term changes. In other words, whether the change is completely reversible or not. But definitely there is evidence that re-immersion causes a partial reversal of these changes. So what we have in mind at the moment, the hypothesis is that this is not a matter, again, of changes in grammatical knowledge or in knowledge representations of grammatical knowledge, but it's a matter of cognitive control. And this is where having some knowledge of cognitive psychology is actually quite useful. And I've been acquiring this knowledge in collaboration with colleagues who are cognitive psychologists. We know that cognitive control, and I'm going to be more precise about which aspects of cognitive control I'm talking about, but we know that cognitive control is involved in sentence processing. We know there are lots of studies on this, but also it's interesting that cognitive control doesn't affect all grammatical structures to the same extent. So the effects of cognitive control are more visible in probabilistic structures, like pronoun resolution, for example. Remember that we're talking about preferences. We're not talking about categorical choices. We're talking about complex contingencies. So the effects of cognitive control have been found before our work, by other people to be more visible for these complex contingencies than for categorical syntactic processing or processing of structures that are less affected by context, for example, or pragmatic interpretation. So to go back to pronouns, which aspects of cognitive control are involved in using anaphoric forms? Well, if you think about it, speakers have to be able to rapidly inhibit irrelevant mappings. So remember those sentences that I showed you before. Paula greeted her mother while she was going out. So Paula and her mother are the two possible antecedents. So either you attach the pronoun to Paula or to her mother. If you go for one, you don't go for the other. So you have to rule out the irrelevant mapping that, that is available. As I said, you have to constantly update your picture of context. So you have to integrate changing information from context, from the assessment of the interlocutor's knowledge state, for example, and so on. And this involves, and I'm going to be more precise about this, this involves not only updating the discourse model, but also disengaging inhibition. So, you know, if you are initially inhibiting a particular kind of attachment of a pronominal reference, then, you know, 3 minutes later, that particular attachment that you've just ruled out might become available, might become, in fact, necessary. So you have to be able to recover from the inhibition that you've applied and actually switch from one type of attachment to the other. So now, and I'll come back to this in a few more details in a second. But let's remember when I said at the beginning that we see a convergence between speakers, native speakers in a situation of attrition and non-native speakers at a relatively advanced level of competence. What we see, however, the convergence is there, but the effect size is not the same. So the overextension of overt pronouns, for example, that we find in a language like Italian is smaller in attrited speakers, so in native speakers of Italian in a situation of attrition, than it is in second language speakers of Italian. So why? So we see a convergence, but not the same magnitude of the effects. So we can explain this on the basis of inhibition in the following way. So in second language speakers, the unwanted language, remember that in all bilinguals, and this is an attested fact, in all bilinguals, all languages are simultaneously active. So when you speak one, you have to inhibit the other. So bilingual speakers, I'm not getting into bilingual speakers who use the same modality at least. I'm not getting into bimodal bilinguals, etc., because the situation is slightly different there. But in unimodal bilinguals, so bilinguals of two spoken languages or more spoken languages, they have to inhibit the unwanted language. So in second language speakers, the unwanted language is arguably their still dominant L1 native language, which needs more resources to be inhibited, to be excluded. Whereas in attrited speakers, the unwanted language is the less dominant second language, which needs fewer resources to be inhibited. So basically, the second language speakers have less or fewer resources to do this kind of job in pronominal reference compared to the attrited speakers. So in a sense, the second language speakers, because they have fewer resources, they tend to overextend the overt pronoun more often than the attrited speakers. So we're focusing on at the moment in joint work with cognitive psychologists is that, in fact, there may be, what we may be seeing is a kind of trade-off between inhibition and integration. And this is not something that I'm making up. This is a well-known phenomenon in cognitive psychology, nothing to do with bilingualism per se, but it's been found and it's well attested experimentally. So the stronger you are in inhibition, the less strong or the more variable you are at pulling things together in integration. And so as we said, the integration of contextual information is vital for using pronominal reference in an appropriate way. And so the integration of contextual information, as I said, requires not only the ability to inhibit irrelevant mappings between pronouns and antecedents, but also to switch, to recover from inhibition, particularly when changes are unpredictable and the situation changes in such a way that the mappings that might have been irrelevant before become relevant in the course of interaction, for example. So this trade-off, if we take this trade-off at a simple value, it means that if bilinguals, particularly late bilinguals, are better at inhibitory control, which is fairly well attested in a variety of studies, the other side of the coin might be much more optionality and variability when it comes to integrating things. If you think about it, you know, these concepts, you know, beyond the terminology, inhibiting something means focusing on what matters, focusing on one aspect and cutting off, excluding everything else. Integration is the opposite. You're pulling together information in order to make a coherent picture. So that's where the trade-off arises. If you want, if there is this trade-off, and this is a hypothesis that requires more research and more studies, then we have the bilingual experience that on the one hand might confer advantages in inhibitory control, as there is a literature out there on, the so-called bilingual advantage and so on. I'm not getting into that, but let's see what is coming out, and let's try to see to what extent it fits, you know, with the linguistic phenomena that we're interested in. At the same time, there may be potential disadvantages in this operation of building central coherence through integration of constantly changing cues, refocusing attention in a variable way and in an unpredictable way. So in a sense, you know, if you want, this is a disadvantage of bilingualism, not really an advantage, if you want to look at things that way. Just to give you a few more data, because we've done studies on this, we've done a study on negative priming, for example. In psychology, negative priming is precisely a slower response to a target stimulus, let's call it probe, that you had to inhibit in the previous trial. So you have to pay attention to a stimulus that was a distractor in a previous trial. And so you've just inhibited it, but now you have to pay attention to it. A classic example is the Stroop paradigm that many of you, I'm sure you're familiar with. So the classic Stroop paradigm in list A is the fact that you have to name the color of the ink in which the word is written, right? So you have to say blue, but the word says red. You have to say purple, but the word says yellow. You have to say black, but the word says green. So there is a conflict between the name of the color that you have to pronounce and the name of the color that you have to read. And being a proficient reader, you can't help reading those words. And so there is a clash, and that slows you down in naming the color. That's a classic Stroop effect. List B shows the negative priming effect. So look at the list B. You have to say green, but the word says blue. So you have to inhibit blue. But now look at the second word. You have to say blue, which is precisely what you've just inhibited. The word says red. The third word, you have to say precisely red, which is what you've just inhibited in the previous trial. So there is an additional source of difficulty in list B, which is this negative priming. So having to recover from the inhibition that you've just applied. And in our study, without going into much detail, we found, for example, that larger negative priming effects in bilinguals compared to monolinguals after 350 milliseconds in the sequence of probes and primes that we showed. It doesn't matter here. Basically, we interpreted this data as a confirmation that bilinguals are more efficient than monolinguals at inhibition. They're much better at inhibiting distracting information. And because of that, they're experiencing larger negative priming effects, because in a way they have more room to recover from when they actually have to name the color that they've just inhibited, for example. Okay, so let's, this trade-off between inhibition and integration is one possible tack on these phenomena from a cognitive point of view. But let's look at another feature of what the phenomena that we've been talking about. The fact that these bilinguals, okay, we've been saying there may be a trade-off, they're less good at integrating information. And what do when that happens? They overuse one form. It's not that they start using pronouns randomly, right? In fact, when they use interpret a null pronoun, they don't really make any they're not different in that respect. The difference is with respect to the overt. So bilinguals are over-explicit. They use fewer reduced form, and they generalize the most redundant form. So the effect of using an overt pronoun in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, generates redundancy. It's unnecessary, basically, because, either the referent is salient, or, in highly inflected languages, you also have inflection that helps you understanding who are you're talking about, and so on. But basically, the overuse of the overt pronoun leads to more redundancy. Why do we see this asymmetry in the direction of the most explicit form? This might really be related to another cognitive characteristic of bilingualism. And again, we're building bridges with the cognitive research on bilingualism. And this is the fact that, as we know, bilingualism can lead to a higher sensitivity to the other person's perspective. So this, there are many studies that show developmental benefits of bilingualism for children. So children become better able at an earlier stage at understanding that it is possible to see things from a different perspective, spatially, or even, in terms of beliefs. And in adults, obviously we don't see developmental effects anymore, but we see that bilingual adults are faster at switching from their own perspective towards the other person's perspective. In other words, they're faster at switching from their own egocentric perspective to embracing another person's perspective. So this means that bilinguals actually may have a higher threshold for deciding when to drop a pronoun, because dropping a pronoun when it's not clear what you're talking about leads to ambiguity. So bilinguals may actually be trying very hard to avoid ambiguity, partly because the bilingual experience makes you more sensitive, to more aware of ambiguity, of not being clearly understood, but also because of potentially better perspective-taking abilities. And so avoiding ambiguity might also be another factor that leads in the direction of overextending the redundant, the over-explicit form. So basically what we see here is a kind of, in fact, different kinds of efficient bilingual adaptations here. So, we see another potential trade-off here, right? Between, and this is again something that we didn't make up, the distinction between a trade-off between being maximally informative and maximally precise and being simpler. So the more informative you are, the less simple you are. And basically what we see in bilinguals is a tendency towards simplicity. So simplicity that goes into the direction of overextending a redundant form at the more explicit form, which arguably can help communication efficiency in the sense that it facilitates conversation, it facilitates communication. Interestingly, this is what we're beginning to see in studies of alignment, as I mentioned at the beginning, alignment among speakers of the same attrited community. So at different levels of attrition, maybe, you know, like me as a member of the Italian community, speaking to Italians who have, you know, arrived, who have been resident in an English-speaking environment for less time. Basically, you know, there is this alignment also tends to lead to more simplicity. So interestingly, to an overuse of the overt form synchronically in interaction. So basically what we see is an adaptive control, cognitive control system. So cognitive control can be shaped in different ways by different types of bilingual experience. And I'm actually going to skip the next two slides for the sake of time. I can come back on this. But bilinguals are not all the same. So again, depending on the type of experience, bilinguals may exhibit more efficient non-linguistic inhibition if they have to apply a lot of inhibition to either language. And the way this non-linguistic inhibition is linked to linguistic inhibition, like in structures like pronouns, and a better ability to disengage and refocus attention, which we've seen is one of the characteristics of effective use of pronominal reference. So one hypothesis that we are exploring at the moment is that attrition, again, to use the bad term, and acquisition are actually two sides of the same coin. In what way? So there may be individual variations such that in people who are, if people who are very good at learning another language might also be the same people whose native language is more open to change. So in other words, being more open to changes due to attrition paves the way towards a better, more advanced acquisition of the same language. And it leads to this convergence between L1 and L2. And it also leads to the fact that, as we know, proficient bilinguals are really not like monolinguals in either language. They're not like monolinguals of their native language. They're not like monolinguals of the second language either. And they can't be expected to be like monolinguals of either language. But this convergence between L1 and L2 needs to be studied within the same individuals. At the moment, what we have is data from different populations. So we have a convergence for the same language between native speakers in a situation of attrition and second language speakers of the same language. But what we need to see is convergence. If you want, convergence between L1 and L2 within the same individuals, which necessarily means looking at different languages and not the same language. So it's, in a way, it's more challenging to see this, but we want to see whether, you know, there may be individual variation in this respect. Also, there may be variation in the bilingual experience, depending on the kind of bilingualism that individual speakers necessarily have to operate. So if they live in a rigidly diglossic environment, for example, where language A is only spoken in one context, language B is only spoken elsewhere, that requires a lot of inhibition because, you know, you can't switch from one language to the other in the same context. So you only speak one language in one context, you only speak the other language in the other context. And that's different from communities, for example, that liberally switch from one language to the other. And so, you know, there's a lot more recovery from inhibition when you have to constantly switch from one language to the other. You don't have to apply a lot of inhibition because otherwise switching becomes more difficult. So a combination of bilingual experience, characteristics of the bilingual experience, and individual differences might actually create a continuum where, you know, we see this evidence of this convergence between attrition and acquisition. So our hypothesis at the moment is that the best second language learners are also the ones where we see the effects of attrition in a more visible way. So I've talked far too long, and many of the ideas that I presented are not final; they're not finalized, and they need a lot of research because at the moment some of them are really at the stage of hypothesis. But in order to explore this hypothesis, we need bridges between languages and other cognitive domains, and I think we really need those. We need bridges across different subfields of research on language, language learning, bilingualism. So not just, you know, I work on attrition only, or I work on second language acquisition only. We need to, you know, as I said recently, connect the dots across subfields and across fields to have a more complete picture. So at this point, I'll stop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Antonella, for a great talk. So we're gonna have some time for questions. So if you have a question, you can just select the raise hand option on the participant list, and we'll pick those questions. And if you cannot speak up, you type your question on the Q&A, and we'll take the question from there for you. We would prefer that you turn your microphone on and ask your question.
Shall I stop sharing the slides, or what do you think, Lucrezia?
I think if you wanna, it's up to you. If you wanna leave them up so that it's easier for you to go back if people ask questions about that,
okay,
that would be possibly better.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All right, so all right, so I have Loretta. I have to select on the participant list to select the participant to speak. Is that right? Okay, all right. So that's fine. So we have Marlise. Marlise, so you have to, I have to, that's what I'm asking, Loretta, for me to unmute for her. Is it on the participant list?
Yes, so if you go to attendees.
Yes.
And you go to Marlise's name, there's allowed to talk.
Yeah, it's not showing for me. It's only showing chat. So can you do that?
Yes, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Antonella, for an excellent talk. So informative and definitely very inspiring. The question that I have is about the overextended pronouns that you did a beautiful job explaining to us how they operate. So the question, according to you, is it a convergence between L1 and L2 that promotes, you know, the emergence of those overextended pronouns, or is it simply transfer from L2? So that's also connected to another question: how does one disambiguate, you know, the two possible antecedents for the overextended pronouns, not, you know, from the bilingual speaker using them, but towards their interlocutor? How does the interlocutor disambiguate? You know, is there prosody involved? So these are the two questions that I have for you.
Thank you very much. I mean, starting from your second question, yes, I mean, clearly there's a big difference between showing a sentence on a screen, right? And you know, with no other elements, you know, prosody, intonation. In real interaction, you know, all these factors may have to be taken into account. So in a sense, yes, we are talking about a simplified situation where, however, allows us to see more clearly, you know, if everything else is controlled for, what kind of a pronominal reference would speakers prefer. Okay, but definitely the phenomenon is more complex as you suggested. Your first question was whether what the cause of this phenomena is. As I said before, but perhaps I wasn't very clear. Yes, I mean, there may be effects of the second language on the first, right? So if we compare an Italian-English bilingual with an Italian-Spanish bilingual, we may find that both of them have a tendency to overextend the overt pronoun, but the Italian-English bilingual may do it to a greater extent, because, I mean, to be, you know, be simplistic perhaps, there are two causes at least, you know, leading in the same direction. So one is, you know, the effects of a language where the choice between null and overt is really not, you know, not there, or definitely not as extensive as in real null subject languages. So there is a convergence of causes, you know, that magnifies the phenomenon. But the fact that the phenomenon is seen also in bilingual speakers of two very similar languages where you wouldn't expect to see this is interesting. I would like to add that even when we talk about, you know, as linguists, you know, we tend to say, okay, you know, Italian and Spanish are null subject languages of the same type, which is fine, except that if you really look, and we did, at the differences between not bilingual, but, you know, Italian and Spanish in so-called monolinguals, right? So not due to bilingualism, the two systems are not exactly the same. So the pronominal inventories are clearly the same, but the conditions on the use of the pronouns are not exactly the same. So again, you know, from a purely linguistic point of view, we may decide to categorize languages as belonging to the same type. But in fact, you know, if we try to see, you know, how the pronominal forms are implemented and used, there are differences even among similar languages.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marlise, you can turn your hand raise function down. And the next question is from Lucy Chung. And Loretta, please, can you turn it on, because I can't switch it on.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. That is a really good talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is sort of like the follow-up on the pronominal system. So I was wondering whether there are like studies probing into like different typology, because the languages that you had there is like Romance languages or like Spanish versus English. But I wonder whether there are studies focusing on, say, Romance languages and, say, Mandarin, because Mandarin, the pronominal system is somehow similar, but it's also slightly different. And the system can be attached to like pragmatic function, discourse function. So I am not sure whether like the prediction that you have here can also be extended to like these different types of languages.
The short answer is no. I'm not aware of any, you know, evidence, and I agree with you. They would be extremely interesting, And in fact, I have a PhD student who will be studying, you know, this precisely, you know, this kind of bilingualism, you know, with Chinese, with Mandarin, and exploring the phenomenon, you know, with null subject languages of a different type. And I agree that it would be extremely interesting, you know, to see whether we end up with similar results or not. But I'm not really aware of any strong evidence about this yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have some more time for questions if people want to raise hand or ask in the Q&A period. I want to ask you a question, Antonella, about the sort of like, it seems to me that you are considering different paths of explanation for the kinds of phenomena that you are taking into account, possibly integrating them. So you're taking, on the one hand, the possibility that some effects in terms of some cognitive effects could play a role here, and that because of possibly an enhanced inhibitory control, that the bilinguals would have a harder time doing these switches in terms of actually correctly using the null versus the overt pronoun. And then you talk about the notion of over-explicitness that the bilinguals would be using, and that possibly would, I presumably would be, they would be overusing the overt form, right?
Yes.
My question is about this notion of over-explicitness and how it facilitates communication in the sense that you were discussing. So there is a perspective from the speaker and the perspective from the listener. So how do you think about that in terms of this notion of facilitating communication?
Okay, you've raised many interesting points, right? And you know, starting from the cognitive factors, as I said, it's not that one cause rules out the others, right? And you know, in most likely case, we are looking at interactions of different causes that, you know, we can study separately, but ultimately we want to know how they fit together. And so, you know, the fact that there may be a trade-off between ability to inhibit and ability to integrate, yes, means, in principle, it means that you can't be optimally good at integrating contextual information all the time. So you see a lot more variability in this behavior. What is interesting, however, is that this doesn't mean that speakers use pronouns randomly. And this is a very important point, because if this inability or, you know, less ability to integrate simply resulted in, you know, not being sure when to use one pronoun or the other, we would see more random use of pronouns, which we don't see. So what we see instead is the overextension of the form that is arguably the most explicit. Well, arguably, it is the most explicit in null subject languages, is the overt form. And why could that facilitate communication? Because, well, because it simplifies life in a sense for the interlocutor. So, you know, you use only one pronoun, and that's it. And there is other, you know, bigger picture factors that we may want to consider. You know, the fact that, I think I said this earlier this afternoon, in languages that are widely spoken and widely learned by non-native speakers, and also they are spoken by attrited speakers in various situations and so on, what we might be seeing is a general tendency towards simplification and towards, you know, communication efficiency, which means also a tendency towards simplification. Now, I don't do diachronic linguistics, you know, as a specialism, you know, but we certainly know, that languages in contact, it wouldn't be a novel discovery that languages in contact, might generate a simplification. And so simplification might be a move towards communication efficiency that is it goes in the same directions. So these phenomena that are of interest to us, so second language acquisition, first language attrition, seem to go in the same direction and could contribute to the same factors. Again, I'm not saying that it's only the cognitive phenomena that we should be considering, or only the linguistic phenomena, or certainly, the linguistic phenomena are very important. The fact that in attrition, we see that it's these, what I would call interface structures that are affected. So interfaces between syntax, grammar, and external domains. Those are the most vulnerable to attrition, whereas more, syntax internal structures that are less affected or not affected by pragmatics, context, and so on, those structures are not really affected by attrition in first generation. So understanding, these linguistic distinctions is very important. But in addition to that, I think, it's very useful to try and combine different perspectives and possibly different factors that play a role in a combined fashion, depending also on factors like linguistic experience, bilingual experience, what kind of bilingualism, what kind of bilingual context are we talking about, and so on and so forth.
Thank you for the detailed answer. I think, Sav, you had a question. I don't know, did you still want to ask a question? So let me give you the allow to talk, and then you can speak up if that's the case.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting, and I'm excited to see shifts in how we're talking about so-called attrition, because I've always found that to be a challenging term, or a term that I don't really like. So one, I have a lot of questions about what you just said, but I wanted to say something sort of related, or ask a related question, which is, you ended, or part of the end of your talk was, you were saying that maybe L1 attrition, and I'm doing air quotes, and L2 acquisition are two sides of the same coin. And I'm wondering, because earlier I talked about acquisition as something that we could maybe think of as happening sort of lifelong. I'm wondering why it has to be two sides of the same coin. Maybe this is just a nitpicky question, but could it not be that it is part of like the same phenomenon, in fact? And if I'm wrong about that, or if I'm sort of misunderstanding what you were saying, could you talk more about that?
Maybe we're actually thinking of the same thing and we're using different terminology. I'm not sure, so for me, two sides of the same coin means, we're really talking about aspects of the same phenomenon. So it's not that attrition is something special that happens only in certain circumstances. I think attrition, happens to different degrees in different individuals, depending on the kind of bilingual experience, languages, and so on. But it does happen, and should be regarded as a natural consequence of learning another language. So in other words, again, one further reason for not taking the monolingual speaker as the point of reference for whatever we do, because, A, the monolingual speaker is more and more idealized, and B, once you start learning a language and learn a language, your native language changes, as a natural phenomenon. And it can change to different extents. Anecdotally, we can all think of people who, even after years of exposure and use of a second language, still, use the first language as a screen for everything they say, or, we can hear, they are using it not only in terms of accents, but also in terms of grammar, as opposed to, people who really manage to, you know, living out of the picture, but, you know, how? You know, what do they do to leave it out to the picture? So leaving it out to the picture may mean that, you know, it's the native language is actually more sensitive, more open to change. And there's some kind of cognitive reconfiguration that happens in these highly proficient speakers in such a way that, you know, they're really highly proficient, basically in both languages, but not like monolingual speakers of those languages, you know, like proficient bilinguals. So I'm sure that, you know, there's a lot that I haven't answered, you know, to your question, because simply because we need more research in order to understand these issues better.
All right, unless we have any other questions, I think we are, yeah, I'm checking here, I don't see any other questions. I want to thank Antonella for being with us and giving this great talk. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank our organizers, the Colloquium committee that is behind the screen here and made things run so smoothly. It's really like a big juggling, dealing with all the stuff about coordinating the talk internationally.
And can I just say, I would love to get more questions. If you have any more questions, please send them to me, because I would really like to have your feedback. Don't be afraid of being critical. I would love to hear from you. Just write to me, and we'll keep the exchange going.
Antonella, if you actually stick around a little bit, I can ask you more questions. It's just like letting people also go.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, of course, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, people can definitely contact you, and yeah, thank you for offering that. Appreciate that, and thank you everyone for attending today. I think we'll close, because I think actually if we want to stay, the organizers have to stay. I realize that, so we can pick up the conversation separately. I realize that. So thank you everyone. Thank you, Antonella.
Thank you.